At dawn on February 4th, 1811, in La Mure-d'Isère, a small and humble village nestled at the foot of the French Alps, Peter Julien Aymard was born. It was a time of great social and spiritual upheaval. France was still recovering from the wounds left by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Despite political and religious uncertainty, Peter Julien's family clung firmly to their Catholic faith, handed down from generation to generation. In this simple environment, yet deeply rooted in Christian values, the young Peter took his first steps in life and in faith. Peter Julien's parents, Jules Aymard and Acaïn Magdalena Peroy, were hard-working peasants, known in the village for their piety and honesty. From an early age, his mother instilled in her son a love of prayer, especially devotion to the most blessed sacrament. It was common for Peter, still a child, to accompany her to Mass and spend long minutes before the tabernacle, fixing his gaze on the altar as if he already sensed the mission God would entrust to him. The home's simplicity and discipline shaped his character. From a very young age, Peter showed an uncommon spiritual sensitivity for his age. While other children were easily distracted, he would remain recollected, contemplating the crucifix or the images of the saints. Once his mother found him on his knees, slowly repeating the words of consecration he had heard at Mass, as if trying to engrave every gesture of the priest upon his soul. These early signs were, for the family and the local pastor, indications that God was calling him to something special. At that time, France still suffered the effects of the religious persecution begun during the Revolution, when convents and monasteries were closed and many priests were killed or exiled. In La Mure, however, faith endured, sustained by families like Peter's. He grew up hearing stories of martyrs and confessors of the faith, and these accounts inflamed his heart with a burning desire to serve God. The small village, though isolated, was a refuge for Catholic practice. Peter's education was simple and marked by material limitations, yet extremely rich in values. He attended the local school, where he stood out for his diligence in studies and his respect for teachers. There were no great libraries in the village, but Peter seized every opportunity to learn. The Catechism was his favorite book, and in it he found not only doctrine, but inspiration to pursue a path of holiness. His prodigious memory helped him memorize long passages of prayers and scripture. Peter Julien's First Communion was an unforgettable milestone in his life. He prepared himself with great zeal, attending the pastor's instructions and making frequent visits to the Blessed Sacrament. On the day of the celebration, his eyes sparkled with emotion as he received Jesus in the Eucharist for the first time. Later, he would recall this moment as the instant he clearly felt the call to dedicate his entire life to the real presence of Christ on the altar. It was the beginning of a deep and indissoluble friendship with the Lord. From that first communion onward, Peter often sought moments of silent adoration. Not infrequently, he left home early to arrive before Mass and remain in prayer. When the church was closed, he would sit on the steps, praying before the door as if he were at Christ's very feet. This perseverance in prayer and his burning love for the Blessed Sacrament would become the hallmark of his entire priestly life. Yet Peter's youth was not free of trials. Still in adolescence, he suffered the painful loss of his mother, whose death left in him a profound void. His mother's absence was for Peter a heavy cross, but also a summons to spiritual maturity. He turned even more to the Virgin Mary, to whom he entrusted his sorrows and difficulties. This filial relationship with Our Lady would become another fundamental pillar of his spirituality. After his mother's death, Peter took on some responsibilities on the family's small property, helping his father and siblings. Even with farm duties, he did not neglect his life of prayer. His desire to become a priest grew daily, But financial constraints and family responsibilities were great obstacles. Even so, he kept the flame of his vocation alive, patiently awaiting the time and means Providence would grant him. The pastor of Lamure, perceiving Peter's zeal and piety, encouraged him to follow the priestly call. With effort and sacrifice, he managed to enroll him in a school in Grenoble, so he could pursue the studies required for seminary admission. Moving to the city was a great challenge for the young man, who left his family environment to face a wider world with new demands and temptations. Nevertheless, his solid faith sustained him. In Grenoble, Peter encountered classmates from diverse backgrounds and viewpoints, some far from the faith. Rather than be negatively influenced, he sought to be an example of conduct, always respectful and dedicated to his studies. He spent hours in the college chapel, asking Jesus for strength to persevere. His discreet and devout life attracted the attention of his teachers, who saw in him a student of uncommon virtue. A striking episode of his youth occurred when, walking through the streets of Grenoble, Peter found a small church open. Upon entering, he saw that the Blessed Sacrament was exposed for adoration. He immediately knelt and, absorbed in prayer, lost track of time. This habit of seeking out and visiting churches to be before the Lord would become one of his constant practices, even before he was ordained a priest. Despite all his fervor, Peter faced serious health difficulties. From youth, he suffered physical weakness and respiratory problems, which at times threatened his continuation in studies. There were moments when he thought it impossible to reach the priesthood, yet his trust in God kept him from giving up. He firmly believed that if God had called him, he would also give him the grace needed to fulfill the mission. With his health debilitated, Peter returned temporarily to Lamure to recuperate. This convalescent period was not idle. He took the opportunity to deepen his spiritual reading and to assist the pastor in parish functions. His presence edified the faithful, who saw in him a young man of ardent faith and serene joy, even amid trials. Recovered, Peter returned to Grenoble to resume his studies. His maturity and perseverance impressed everyone. Now, more aware of the difficulties and demands of the priesthood, he devoted himself earnestly to theology and spirituality, always keeping his focus on the mission of serving Christ and the Church. He knew that every day of study was one more step toward the altar. In his late adolescence, Peter began to develop an even more intense devotion to the Eucharist, understanding it not only as the real presence of Christ, but as the center and source of all Christian life. He spent long periods meditating on the Eucharistic mystery and already nourished the desire to spread this devotion among the faithful, though he did not yet imagine the breadth of his future mission. Contact with exemplary priests in Grenoble strengthened his ideal. Some priests, aware of his story, advised him to persevere despite his frail health. They told him that God does not choose the strongest, but those who trust entirely in him. These words encouraged Peter, who saw in his own fragility an opportunity to depend even more on divine grace. During this period, he also cultivated friendship with other young men, discerning their vocation, forming a small circle of spiritual support. Together they prayed, studied, and encouraged one another on the journey. Peter stood out for his serenity and firmness of principle, qualities that made him a reference point among his peers. A decisive turning point in his formation was the discovery of the works of a St. John Eudes and St. Alphonsus Liguori, whose writings on the Eucharist and devotion to the Sacred Heart profoundly touched his spirit. These texts shaped his theological and pastoral vision, awakening in him the longing to lead the faithful to a more intimate relationship with Christ present on the altar. Peter also learned early that the spiritual life requires sacrifice. He practiced small daily mortifications, offering them for the sanctification of priests and the strengthening of faith in France. This willingness to sacrifice would become more evident in future years when he assumed great responsibilities in the Church. Peter's vocation matured as the fruit of long intellectual and spiritual preparation. He understood that desiring to be a priest was not enough. One had to belong entirely to Christ, renounce oneself, and embrace the cross with joy. This awareness would accompany him throughout life, especially when he had to face misunderstandings and challenges in the mission God would entrust to him. In 1829, at age 18, Peter entered the minor seminary, taking a concrete step toward the priesthood. His joy was immense, but new trials soon arose. The demands of study and his health difficulties would again test his perseverance, but his confidence in providence remained unshakable. In the seminary, Peter distinguished himself not only academically but also for his piety. He took part in all spiritual activities with great recollection and devoted special attention to the liturgy. His devotion to the Blessed Sacrament continued to grow, becoming the central axis of his interior life. Seminary life was also fertile ground for vocational discernment. Peter listened attentively to the advice of his formators, accepting guidance and correction with humility. He knew he was being molded for a mission that would require not only theological knowledge, but above all, holiness of life. Upon completing this first phase of formation, Peter Julian Aymard already possessed a clear awareness of his calling, to be a priest who would adore, love, and make others love Jesus in the Eucharist. Although he still did not know how God would fully accomplish this purpose, he was determined to give his whole life to this ideal, trusting that the Holy Spirit would guide his next steps. Ordained in 1834, Peter Julian Aymard entered the priestly ministry with an ardor that hardly fit in his chest. Frail health did not prevent him from taking charge of his first parish in Chat, where he found scattered faithful and little sacramental practice. Undaunted, he dedicated himself to restoring liturgical dignity, refurbishing altars, teaching catechism door to door, and keeping the confessional open until late hours. His constant presence before the tabernacle, even when exhausted, awakened in many the desire to return to Sunday Mass. Before long, the once nearly empty church again became the heart of the community. The transfer to Montinard-Dige brought similar challenges and confirmed his strategy. Everything began with the Eucharist. Processions and holy hours rekindled the faith, while visits to the sick and poor gave concrete face to the sacramental love he preached from the pulpit. His health crises, however, became frequent. With each relapse, Peter offered his suffering for the sanctification of the faithful. The void left by his mother's death was filled by a filial abandonment to the Virgin Mary, to whom he entrusted his apostolate and his own weaknesses. Thus matured in his heart the desire to give himself in an even more radical way. Contact with the Marist Fathers showed him a communal path in which Marian devotion united with missionary work. In 1839, after deep discernment, he decided to leave the diocese and join the congregation, renouncing the security of parish life. There he discovered the itinerant nature of popular missions, preaching in villages, catechizing crowds, retreats for clergy and laity. His simple words, inflamed with Eucharistic love, converted hardened hearts and awakened dormant vocations. Even on muddy roads, he inspired his companions with the refrain, "A missionary must belong completely to Jesus and completely to souls." As a Marist formator of young men, Peter insisted on the importance of personal adoration. He taught that a preacher, before speaking of God, needed to listen to God at length in the silence of the tabernacle. Under his guidance, many novices transformed their free time into visits to the altar, where they learned more than from books. The growing responsibility of provincial superior placed administrative tasks before him, but it did not steal his contemplative spirit. Even while writing reports, he kept his inner gaze fixed on the tabernacle, convinced that pastoral effectiveness springs from intimacy with Christ. With the passing years, the specific call to spread perpetual adoration became overwhelming. During night vigils, he felt that Jesus in the sacrament was asking him for a new work entirely consecrated to the Eucharist. Successive internal and external confirmations culminated in 1856. In the courageous decision to leave the Marists to found the Benl Congregation of the Blessed Sacrament. Obedience cost tears, painful farewells and material uncertainties, but Peter walked assured that where God's will is, there is our peace. Thus was born the first nucleus of adorers that would forever change the face of many Christian communities when, on May 13, 1856, the door of the small house on the Rue d'Enfer in Paris opened. The adventure of the Congregation of the Blessed Sacrament officially began. The place was modest, furniture scarce, and sustenance uncertain, but the fervor of the first companions replaced any resource. Taking turns before the improvised altar, they spent hours in silent prayer, convinced that the future of the work did not depend on full coffers, but on inflamed hearts. At every difficulty, Peter repeated, "Adoration is our treasure. The rest will be added unto us." From the outset, the founder united contemplation and mission. After long night vigils, they went out into the working-class streets of Paris, inviting children to catechism and adults to confession. Many, intrigued by the joy of those poor men, accepted the invitation and found in the chapel a rest for weary souls. On Sundays, Eucharistic processions pierced the neighborhood's religious indifference, reminding every passerby that God dwelt in their midst. Reports of profound conversions multiplied, attributed to a mere instant before the monstrance. Archbishop Sibour's approval encouraged new foundations. In Marseille, Angers, and Lyon, the same story repeated itself. Small communities, few resources, but great love for the Blessed Sacrament. For Peter, expansion was not a matter of numbers, but fidelity to the charism. Before opening any house, he made sure there would be enough adorers to sustain, day and night, praise to the Lord. Without that flame, he said, the work would be a lamp without oil. Peter's zeal extended to the laity. Inspired, he created the aggregations of the Blessed Sacrament, enabling entire families to commit to adoration shifts in their parishes. Thus, the spirituality passed beyond monastery walls into homes, schools, and workshops. Rough factory men knelt beside children in reverent silence, proving that Eucharistic love makes no distinction of social condition. In Bray 1864, pontifical approval confirmed the authenticity of the charism and propelled it beyond borders. Peter, however, remained humble. He called himself a poor servant of the Blessed Sacrament, and reminded the brothers that the congregation's greatness was not measured in buildings, but in souls transformed by encountering Jesus. The tireless rhythm of travel, preaching, and foundations wore out his body, but strengthened his spirit. Until his last heartbeat, he wanted only one thing, that Christ be loved in the sacrament of his love. With the congregation firmly rooted in France, the time came to cast nets into deeper waters. Belgium was the first foreign territory to welcome the work. There, the tradition of Corpus Christi processions resonated with the ideal of continuous adoration. Modest houses became centers of Eucharistic radiance, where priests, sisters, and laity learned to link every pastoral action to the tabernacle. Soon invitations came from Rome, which saw in the congregation an ally to rekindle fervor in times of growing rationalism. The expansion did not stop in Europe. In Brazil, religious faced immense distances and diverse cultures to erect adoration chapels in ports, coffee plantations, and inland towns. The simple exposition of the Blessed Sacrament drew illiterate laborers and society ladies alike, united by the same hunger for God. In North America, the accelerated industrial pace required flexible schedules, so the brothers opened night-long adoration shifts, offering spiritual refuge to factory workers and weary immigrants. Each new foundation presented specific challenges: extreme climates, unknown languages, opposition from anti-clerical groups. Peter taught them to respond with patience and trust. If the Lord wishes to remain here, he will open the doors. Under this certainty, regional Eucharistic congresses emerged, seeds of the great international gatherings that would later unite multitudes around the living bread. Laity trained by the congregation became apostles in their parishes, organizing holy hours and encouraging frequent communion, a practice that the future St. Pius X would officially extend to the whole Church. At the heart of this missionary impetus remained simplicity. No matter how numerous the religious houses, they kept Spartan furniture and rigorous prayer schedules. Beauty appeared in the carefully prepared liturgy: Gregorian chant, candlelight, incense rising like an offering. Many bishops, moved by this reverence, asked the adorers to train local clergy in the ars celebrandi, Psalm. Thus the congregation became a bridge between tradition and renewal, uniting past and future in the perennial flame of the altar. When Peter's fame crossed oceans, he repeated that the true protagonist was Jesus sacramented. To prove it, he doubled down on penitential life, discreet fasts, nights on the chapel floor, smiles offered even when his strength waned. The world might call him apostle of the Eucharist, but he saw himself only as the messenger who leads to the King's door. You see, in this spirit, he accepted the final sufferings that preceded his death, certain that the work would continue by the power of Christ's real presence. From 1867 onward, his health crises grew more severe. Each violent cough reminded him that the body had limits, but the soul seemed to expand in desire for reparation. Peter understood he needed to unite adoration even more closely to penance, offering himself as a holocaust for those who lived far from the sacraments. Prolonged fasts, sleepless nights before the altar, and long meditations on the Passion marked his final years. Unable to find rest, he transformed pain into silent intercession. During the Franco-Prussian War, congregation houses took in wounded soldiers and refugees. Peter, debilitated, encouraged the brothers by letters, teaching that each bandage placed on a wound could be an act of adoration if done in union with the suffering Christ. This vision definitively integrated charity and worship, showing that the consecrated host impels concrete self-giving. Even limited to writing, the founder continued guiding foundations and appointing superiors capable of preserving the charism. In L'Amour, to which he retired in his final months, childhood and end of life met. The same altar where he had made his first communion became his farewell bed. There he celebrated Mass as often as he could, dragging himself to the sanctuary, supported by moved brothers. Each word of consecration came out as a whisper, yet filled the church with testamentary power. He kept in his heart the certainty that the congregation would flourish if it remained small in the world's eyes and great in adoration. At dawn, on the August 1st, 1871, after receiving the last sacraments, Peter fixed his gaze on the monstrance placed at his bedside and surrendered his soul. The ensuing silence was broken by a soft chant from the brothers, thanking God for the gift of that father. The news spread quickly. The apostle of the Eucharist had departed for eternal adoration, but his death was a seed. Before the year ended, new vocations knocked at novitiate doors, and stories of healings attributed to his intercession began to circulate. Longing did not keep the congregation from action. Gathered in chapter, The religious decided to govern themselves strictly by the constitutions and the founders' letters. The motto was clear: innovate nothing unnecessary, omit nothing essential. The tomb in Namur became a source of consolation and fervor. Pilgrims arrived with candles and rosaries, and many left transformed. This flow of graces strengthened the brothers to consolidate existing houses and respond to new missionary invitations. Internal formation gained prominence. Instructors read Peter's writings aloud to novices, explaining that each paragraph had been born of hours of adoration. Thus, study was not merely academic exercise, but an extension of prayer. In post-war France, marked by social crises, the adorers engaged in relief works, distributing bread and shelter. They did so not as an NGO, but as an extension of the Eucharistic table, where Christ breaks himself for all. Reports of miracles reached the General Council, coming from different countries: cures of incurable diseases, reconciliation of couples, instant conversions before the tabernacle indicated by Peter, all carefully documented. These dossiers would later feed the beatification process. The superiors, however, insisted the greatest miracle is a soul returning to grace. Let us work for these daily wonders. Within a few years, the congregation's map showed points of light in various European nations, in the Americas, and in new missions in Africa. Every foundation replicated the same tripod: perpetual adoration, catechesis, and charity. Even where priests were scarce, committed laity kept nighttime shifts, proving that the Eucharist empowers the simple. This fidelity attracted the recognition of bishops and the discreet help of benefactors. By the late 1870s, it was clear that the seed planted by the founder was sprouting vigorously. The brothers experienced internal struggles, material shortages, and anti-clerical hostility, but they remained firm thanks to fraternal unity. Each chapter assembly ended with a communal holy hour, reaffirming that decisions were born at Jesus' feet. Thus, the congregation entered the new century with confidence, guided by the living memory of Tardun, St. Peter Julian. The end of the 19th century found the congregation in full globalization. In Rome, the house on Via Merulana became a meeting point for pilgrims wanting to learn the art of adoration. Priest students from various orders attended retreats and took the method back to their communities of origin. The first proposals for the International Eucharistic Congresses arose, planned in partnership with enthusiastic cardinals. In Spain and Portugal, the spirituality found fertile soil among confraternities of the Blessed Sacrament. Processions lasted deep into the night, and many young people chose the altar over popular dances. In Poland and Lithuania, under oppressive regimes, the silent presence of the tabernacle fueled peaceful resistance and hope. The religious helped hide consecrated hosts in clandestine homes where families prayed at the risk of imprisonment. Crossing to the Americas opened cultural horizons. In French Canada, small wooden chapels became fortresses of adoration against urban secularization. In the United States, nighttime shifts adapted to factory schedules. The night adorers were workers who exchanged the bar for Christ's presence. In Argentina and Chile, rural missions installed itinerant tabernacles carried by mules, guaranteeing at least 1 hour of weekly adoration in isolated villages. Influence reached the Vatican. And Leo XIII publicly praised the apostolate and granted indulgences to holy hours. Pius XI, a great promoter of frequent communion, saw in Peter Julian's work a forerunner of his liturgical reforms. Magisterial documents cited the congregation as an example of unity between interior worship and external action, encouraging parishes to organize adoration shifts. This recognition brought new challenges, avoiding triumphalism and preserving original simplicity. Superiors insisted on periodic formation, reminding that without interior silence, exterior grandeur is an empty mask. Despite numerical expansion, each house committed to real poverty, with worn desks and patched breviaries. The only admissible luxury was the gold of the Eucharistic lamp, the single wealth Peter would accept for his sons. Canonical steps began with the opening of the diocesan process in Grenoble, where living witnesses narrated improbable cures and radical conversions linked to Peter. Boxes of letters and spiritual notebooks were examined by theologians who confirmed their orthodoxy and depth. The proclamation of Venerable crowned his reputation for heroic virtue, bringing joy to communities that already considered him a saint. For beatification, an approved miracle involved the instantaneous cure of a Belgian girl's degenerative bone disease after prayer at his tomb. In 1925, Pius X declared Blessed Peter Julian Aymard, presenting him as a response to the triumphant rationalism of the era. New graces multiplied, even in lands he had never physically visited. The miracle required for canonization occurred in the United States. A priest with terminal septicemia recovered immediately after colleagues prayed the Beatus' novena. The Vatican Medical Commission attested to the absence of scientific explanation. John 23 celebrated the canonization on December 9, 1962, during the sessions of the Second Vatican Council, highlighting the saint's harmony with the Council's liturgical renewal. Since then, his liturgical feast on August 2nd, optional memorial, has become an occasion for parishes to introduce holy hours, Eucharistic blessings, and youth vigils. Books and films spread his story, while scholars studied his thought as a bridge between Trent and Vatican II. The serene face of St. Peter Julian now adorns adoration chapels worldwide, reminding all that true reform is born of the altar. In the century marked by hyperconnectivity, Aymard's message sounds like an invitation to the desert of the heart. In silent retreats, the faithful rediscover the value of simply remaining before the tabernacle, unhurried and undistracted. Testimonies of young people freed from addictions after nights of adoration repeat the experience of 19th century workers. Only the fire of the real presence can melt invisible chains. Parishes that introduce weekly adoration shifts notice increases in confessions, vocations, and social works. Pastors report that where the host is loved, catechesis flourishes and internal disputes diminish. Peter Julian's vision is fulfilled. A Eucharistic community becomes naturally missionary, for from the altar radiates a charity that crosses boundaries. If contemporary society suffers fragmentation, well-celebrated liturgy, the center of Aymardian spirituality, offers an experience of real communion. Reverence in gesture, the beauty of chant, and contemplative silence testify that the human being lives not only on speed, but on eternity. Each holy hour is a lesson in gratuity in a world that monetizes everything. In digital spaces, Catholic influencers quote St. Peter Julian to motivate minutes of virtual adoration, encouraging followers to visit the actual Blessed Sacrament. Apps point to 24-hour chapels, realizing the saint's dream of seeing Jesus adored without interruption. Thus, the flame lit in the French Alps reaches the cloud of the internet without losing heat or light. The clearest proof of his legacy's relevance is perhaps in the lives of ordinary lay people, parents who, after work, stop at church to give thanks, the sick who offer pain for priest sanctification, children who learn to be silent before the host. Future generations will find in these experiences the same treasure that transformed Peter Julian, the certainty that God remains with us, humble, silent, passionate. Contemplating the trajectory of St. Peter Julian Aymard is to walk a path where the Eucharist reveals itself as source, summit, and horizon. He teaches that the Church's great reforms do not come from human strategies, but from the renewal of the heart before the living Christ. His life confirms that frail health, poverty of means, and external opposition do not impede fruitfulness when everything is laid at the foot of the altar. Today, every Christian is invited to become an adorer in spirit and truth. This begins with Sunday Mass attendance, continues in thanksgiving after communion, and matures in moments of silent adoration. The experience transforms the way we view the world. Enemies become brothers for whom we pray. Daily work becomes an offering united to the chalice. Suffering turns into reparation. In families, domestic altars re-emerge, reminding that the domestic church is nourished by the same bread as the great assembly. In cities, 24-hour adoration chapels shine like night beacons, offering hope to those crossing spiritual deserts. Among young people, Eucharistic vigils replace empty parties, proving that joy and sacrifice can walk together. As this narrative closes, the saint's appeal resounds. Pray, adore, make reparation. Moldi. It is not a slogan, but a life program capable of renewing parishes, dioceses, and entire nations. Whoever embraces this call discovers that the Eucharist is not merely food, but a school of love, a hospital for souls, and a foretaste of heaven. May every reader allow themselves to be touched by this legacy, echoing Peter Julian's cry. Come to Jesus Eucharist. He waits for you. He loves you. He longs to set the world ablaze with the fire of his heart. Eudain, faced with such a promise, all that remains is to open the doors, kneel down, and let the luminous silence of the tabernacle transform history, beginning with our own lives.